In our previous lessons on the book of Proverbs, we have examined the place of Proverbs in non-literate societies and the need to internalize wisdom, which is a unique emphasis for Proverbs. We worked through an introduction of Proverbs, including its name, outline, and distinct sections, authorship, and date. We covered the purpose statement for the entire book found in chapter 1, verses 1 to 7. And we discussed the literary technique conveying wisdom through speeches given by the father to his son, often marked by the phrase, "my son." Among the 7 speeches, we noted the unique structure of speech 2, which in fact is a 21-line poem. Speech 4 emphasized the generational transference of knowledge from grandfather to father to son. We found a content anomaly between speech 5 and 6 that fits better at the end of speech 5 than the beginning of speech 6, though where it actually fits is debated by many scholars. Speech 7 sounds like a story parable illustrating the dangers of falling prey to the devious ways of a prostitute. For this lesson, let us remember that the Old Testament contains at least 4 major branches of literature: historical, priestly, prophetic, and wisdom. For wisdom literature, the wise men of Israel gathered material together for the purpose of teaching a practical religious philosophy through which a good man might find satisfaction in life. Such wisdom was intended to reflect a moral order that had been established and illustrated through experience. By generalizing from life's experiences, these wise men produced a substantial body of rules and proverbs which act as indicators of this moral structure of life. The proverbs gathered for this book were intended to become guideposts for skill in living, to provide equilibrium in life's chaotic experience, and to help bring success in one's personal, familial, communal, and business relationships. Proverbs on one level is intelligence and shrewdness. On another it is common sense, sound judgment, and moral understanding. According to Proverbs, the extent to which one can seek, obtain, and practice wisdom will determine how successfully he can walk the right path and enjoy life. To neglect wisdom is to encounter foolishness, shame, sorrow, poverty, moral failure, and ruin. In Proverbs, the father lectures his son through speeches to highly value, aggressively pursue, and obtain wisdom. By doing so, the father assures his son of a prosperous life full of peace, success, happiness, and blessings for himself and his children. However, the father is not the only one who gives a speech. Wisdom, who is personified in feminine form, also gives 2 speeches. They are found in chapters 1 and 8. I believe Proverbs presents wisdom as a female to portray her as a true life companion, a lover, a wife, a mate for the son, instead of the foolish worldly philosophy espoused by the ungodly. In her 2 speeches, wisdom calls out for followers or suitors who will listen and answer her invitation to embrace her instruction and receive the blessings she bestows. Let's begin this lesson by examining wisdom's first speech in chapter 1, verses 20 to 33. There it says, "Out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall she cries out. At the city gate she makes her speech. How long will you who are simple love your simple ways? How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? Repent at my rebuke. Then I will pour out my thoughts to you. I will make known to you my teachings. But since you refuse to listen when I call, and no one pays attention when I stretch out my hand, since you disregard all my advice and do not accept my rebuke, I in turn will laugh when disaster strikes you. I will mock when calamity overtakes you. When calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster sweeps you over like a whirlwind, when distress and trouble overwhelm you. Then they will call to me, but I will not answer. They will look for me, but will not find me. Since they hated knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord, since they would not accept my advice and spurned my rebuke, they will eat the fruit of their ways and be filled with the fruit of their schemes. For the waywardness of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear of harm. Let me give a few technical notes about wisdom's speech. In verses 20 and 21, wisdom moves through the city to public places to position herself to speak. The wicked companions in the father's first speech plot their evil in secret, chapter 1, verses 10 to 18. Wisdom does her work openly and without fear of punishment or shame. She cries out in the public squares and the noisy street corners. The contrast of secrecy and openness illustrates to the son that wisdom is the superior and more respectable companion. In verses 22 to 33, wisdom's speech sounds negative because she rebukes the simple for not seeking and following her in order to avoid destruction. Wisdom's greatest difficulty in gaining followers is that the simple love their ways of wickedness, as in verse 22. They do not want to exchange their habits, values, and personal pleasures for a better way. They reject the advice of wisdom, hate knowledge, choose not to fear the Lord, and because of these are blinded from the more excellent choice. In this context, the simple wisdom calls out to are the unlearned or inexperienced. Simple does not mean a fool. In verses 23 and 24, wisdom offers her heart and thoughts to the simple, but they are rejected. Most likely she is rejected because she comes in the unpleasant form of advice, correction, and sometimes rebuke. Since the simple don't like correction, they reject wisdom's invitation, even though her correction is for their own good. This reminds us of the correction spoken of in speech 3 by the Father as being a sign of sonship, chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. In other words, because parents care about their children, they will discipline them to help them learn so that they may avoid punishment, shame, ruin at the hands of others. However, at the time, children often do not appreciate the discipline they receive and instead hate it. Verse 28 says, "There is a time when wisdom will not answer, when disaster, calamity, distress, and trouble overwhelm the simple or wicked. Wisdom will not answer their call for her." At first, this seems harsh or even hypocritical. Why does she call out for them, but refuse to answer when they call out for her? The answer is the timing of their call. They do not seek her before disaster and ruin, but only afterward. Consider the nature of sin and wickedness and its destructive character. Wisdom would teach us to avoid the plots of wicked men. But what happens to the simple man who agrees to follow and then is caught in murder? Can he undo the murder or its penalty? What wisdom will save him from his just punishment? When the simple commits adultery and impregnates the woman, what wisdom will save the simple man from the coming child? Let me give a modern-day example. What wisdom can save a young man who commits fornication and then contracts AIDS? How will wisdom save him from this terrible disease? There are some sinful actions and consequences that cannot be undone by wisdom. Instead, wisdom says, "They will eat the fruit of their ways," verse 31. Now, there are some mistakes and sin that bring difficulty that can be corrected. And in those cases, wisdom can help correct the situation. But wisdom cannot repair a broken egg, spilled milk, or a situation where the deed cannot be undone. At such times, the older, wiser group will say something like, "Do you see now? I told you not to do that, but you wouldn't listen. You went ahead and did your own thing, ignoring my advice. You made this bed. Now you must lie in it." Wisdom's greatest asset is to learn from her early on so that the young man can avoid the mistakes and troubles of life. Wisdom says, Those who listen to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear or harm. Verse 33. Consider a similar proverb found later in the book. A prudent or wise man sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. Chapter 22, verse 3. Wisdom calls out to hear her voice. Let us all respond to her call now before it's too late. Chapter 8 contains the second speech by wisdom. This speech is neatly structured into 5 sections, including first the introduction, verses 1 to 3, 3 main parts consisting of verses 4 to 11, verses 12 to 21, and verses 22 to 31, and the conclusion, verses 32 to 36. Apparently, wisdom is introduced by the Father in the introduction, verses 1 to 3. Wisdom's speech is not like the other speeches in chapters 1 to 7. Here, wisdom speaks about herself like no other place in Proverbs. Part 1 of wisdom's speech, verses 4 to 11, deals directly with humanity in general and points to wisdom's high integrity, noble things, right and truth. Wisdom calls out to all humans. She shows no partiality. Verse 4. Wisdom outlines her purpose as allowing the simple to gain prudence and understanding. Verse 5. Here prudence can mean far-sightedness, judiciousness, caution, discretion, and shrewdness. Wisdom's words are described as worthy, right, true, just, and faultless. Verses 6 to 9. And wisdom is compared to precious metals such as silver and gold. This comparison is also found in chapter 2, verse 4, chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, and also chapter 16, verse 16. In part 2, verses 12 to 21, wisdom speaks about herself and 2 aspects of her work: her royal associations, verses 12 to 16, and the benefits she brings to those who love her, verses 17 to 21. Wisdom hates evil thought, such as pride and arrogance, and evil actions, such as wicked behavior and perverse speech, verses 13. Wisdom brings more than just understanding. She brings power. But power for what? Power to change, power to succeed, verse 14. Wisdom says, "Through me kings reign," verse 15. This phrase may refer to Solomon specifically as mentioned in 1 Kings 3, verse 9 and 28, but it certainly includes all kings generally. King Hezekiah is mentioned in Proverbs chapter 25, verse 1, and King Lemuel in chapter 31, verse 1. Verses 17 to 21 is framed by the word love, both in verse 17 and 21. Wisdom loves those who love her. There is also an emphasis on seeking and finding. For Proverbs, finding a wife and finding wisdom are connected not only in words and action, but also theme. Also in this passage, wisdom's gifts include riches and honor, enduring wealth and prosperity, fruit better than gold and silver, righteousness, justice, and full treasures. In part 3, verses 22 to 32, wisdom speaks of her origin from God and her play and delight with God and humans. Interestingly, the Septuagint, the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, adds another line of verse to introduce chapter 8, verses 22 to 31. The Septuagint says, "If I tell you about daily happenings, I will now remind you of what happened in ages past." Verses 22 to 25 forms a mysterious passage. Wisdom has a special relationship with God, created by Him and existing before all else. This passage is framed by the phrases "brought forth" and "given birth," much like an inclusio. Amazingly, wisdom witnesses and cooperates in the creation acts of God, verses 27 to 29. The specific mention of wisdom as a craftsman at God's side suggests an active participation. Generally, God uses wisdom to create the universe, or as scientists call the orderly phenomenon of our physical world today, intelligent design. God intelligently designs the universe by wisdom. Some church groups have taught in the past that wisdom in chapter 8 refers to Jesus. They point out that he is not the Son of God because he was created by God, verses 22 and 25. They teach that Jesus was created first and then helped in creation and given a place of preeminence over all. I believe wisdom is the primary topic of this speech, as it is for all the speeches of the Father to his Son. It seems to me to be poor hermeneutics to read Jesus into this passage. The conclusion to wisdom's speech, verses 32 to 36, consists of a command and a blessing for those who listen to her and find her. In verses 32 to 34, wisdom seems to be talking instead of the Father, even though she calls out to "my sons." Some scholars suggest wisdom here sounds like a mother instructor. In verse 34, the phrase "waiting at my gates" indicates not only intense searching, but reflects an eager lover at the door of the house of his beloved. In verse 35, the word "find" means more than a search. It also carries the idea of attaining something. In verse 36, the word used in the phrase "whoever fails to find me" is the same word often translated as sin. It literally means to fall short of the goal. Indeed, it would be a sin not to seek and gain God's wisdom, for we know right relationship with God is gaining wisdom. That is the message of an earlier speech. So let's reconstruct the first 8 chapters of Proverbs. These chapters contain 7 speeches by the Father to his Son. He strongly encourages his Son to seek for wisdom as for silver and gold. Wisdom is spoken of as a woman of great value. He who finds her receives great blessings. Wisdom also speaks. She calls out for those who would listen. She is ready to bless those who listen to her. Her gifts include riches, honor, and power. The Father also warns of the deceptive speech and actions of the adulteress, who I believe also represents ungodly cleverness. This foolish adulteress lies in wait for those whom she can devour. The Son must stay far from her, lest he go swiftly to ruin and the grave. At this point, I can almost hear the Son say, "But how can I tell the difference between these 2 women? If both are calling out for me, how will I know which woman is wisdom and which is the adulteress?" Or more to Proverbs' point, how can I know the difference between God's wisdom and the world's cleverness? And this is an excellent question. In today's world where so many push forward their own thoughts and opinions and portray them as wisdom, it's hard for us to know which one is correct. How can we tell the difference? How can we know which one to choose? How can we avoid the traps of the adulteress? This problem sets up chapter 9 of Proverbs. The structure of chapter 9 seems confusing to many scholars. Verses 1 to 6 clearly describe the woman wisdom, her house, verse 1, the feast she has prepared, verses 2 and 3, and her call to the simple, verses 4 to 6. Verses 13 to 18 describe the woman folly or adulteress, and her house, verse 14, her call to the simple, verses 15 and 16, and the feast that she offers, verse 17. The 2 calls are set in contrast to each other as options between which the Son must choose. Whose house will he enter to dine and live? Let's read both invitations and look more closely at what they offer. Wisdom's house is described first in chapter 9, verses 1 to 6. It says, "Wisdom has built her house. She has set up its 7 pillars. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her servants, and she calls from the highest point of the city, 'Let all who are simple come to my house.' To those who have no sense, she says, 'Come, eat my food and drink the wine I've mixed. Leave your simple ways, and you will live. Walk in the way of insight.'" Skipping verses 7 to 12, we find the description of the house of folly or foolishness in chapter 9, verses 13 to 18. It says, "Folly is an unruly woman. She is simple and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house, on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way, 'Let all who are simple come to my house.' To those who have no sense, she says, 'Stolen water is sweet, food eaten in secret is delicious.' But little do they know that the dead are there, that her guests are deep in the realm of the dead." There are some notable similarities between the two houses. Let's list them. Both wisdom and folly are women. Both have houses. Both have prominent places at the highest point in the city. Both have prepared a meal for those who enter. Both call out and invite passers-by to enter. Both begin with the same message. "Let all who are simple come in here," she says to those who lack judgment. If both women are similar in circumstances and speech, how can the student of wisdom identify the right house to enter? How can he know he has chosen wisely? The author of Proverbs includes slight differences within the text. Let's look more closely to see if we can discern the differences between the houses of wisdom and folly. Some of these differences include: wisdom's house has 7 pillars or columns, while folly's house has no mention of pillars. Wisdom's house seems more substantial and permanent than the house of folly. Remember, 7 could mean perfect for the Hebrew mind. Notice also that wisdom builds her house. Folly is not called a builder. In fact, Proverbs 14:1 teaches the wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands a foolish woman tears hers down. This suggests folly did not build her house. She may not even own her house. To put it in modern terms, folly may just be renting her house in a respectable area where she does not legitimately belong. Wisdom sends out her invitation by the mouth of maidens. Folly sits at the door of her house and calls out loudly, a characteristic of foolishness. Wisdom appears richer than folly. Wisdom seems almost royal in her behavior, while folly seems very common, if not vulgar, in her approach. The meals are different. Wisdom sets out meat and mixed wines, suggesting a rich diet. Folly sets out water and food. Some scholars suggest the word for food could be translated bread. Folly makes the simple want her meal because she shrouds it in improper gain and secrecy. These are similar to the plan of the wicked companions in the father's first speech. She appeals to the fallen nature of man. She entices guests to her table by suggesting it is forbidden while ignoring its meager content. Wisdom offers content. Folly offers excitement. And finally, the end results are quite different for each house. Wisdom promises life and understanding if you enter her house. Folly hides the fact that suffering and death await those who enter her house. The writer of Proverbs wants his readers to understand that the similarities between the house of wisdom and folly are close enough to bring confusion to the simple-minded. Without sufficient investigation and observation, the simple-minded may end up in the wrong house and suffer for it. So how can the son know which house he is entering and at what table he is dining? How can he tell the difference between these two houses? Proverbs chapter 9, verses 7 to 12 gives the son 2 ways to help him see the differences between the houses and discern which house he should enter. A very important way, listed second, verses 10 to 12, is to fear the Lord and gain knowledge of the Holy One. Fearing the Lord means to place Him as the most important or supreme in our lives. It is living by His standards. Loving God and honoring Him becomes the foundation for living in the house of wisdom. When we love and respect God, we will seek to know His Word, will, and wisdom for our lives. When we follow God's teaching instead of man's teaching, we will live in the house of wisdom and obtain life, understanding, and all the blessings wisdom promises. After all, to fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Chapter 1, verse 7. The first way given, verses 7 to 9, is a test of our attitude. When we are corrected, do we get angry at the one who corrects us? Or do we accept the correction and add it to our learning and understanding? The one who refuses correction will end up in the house of folly. The one who accepts correction will live in the house of wisdom. In fact, for Proverbs, a mark of a wise man is the ability to accept counsel, correction, and even a rebuke. In effect, verses 7 to 12 revisit the introduction of Proverbs in chapter 1, verses 1 to 7, and share three thematic thoughts to form an inclusio for the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. The 3 points paralleled include fearing the Lord, growing in knowledge by the wise, and despising wisdom by the foolish. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs begin and end with a call to value wisdom by syncing one's life to God through fearing or honoring the Lord. The Father instructs His Son through a series of speeches, illustrating how much better things will go if the Son will value, seek, obtain, and use wisdom to light His path. Mixed into these speeches by the Father are 2 speeches by wisdom. She calls out publicly to all who would listen. She speaks of her close relationship with God, her importance and value in creation, and the blessings she brings to any who follow her. But then the Father warns, or the Son realizes, that the world presents competing philosophies to God's wisdom. Folly also sets up her house and pretends to be legitimately calling the simple to eat at her table. Folly and wisdom superficially appear to be the same. So closer inspection must take place to discern the truth. The Son must have 2 important tools in order to differentiate between the houses of wisdom and folly: fear of the Lord and a teachable spirit. Without these, the Son may fail to choose correctly and as a result experience a disastrous life. But these first 9 chapters also set up the house of wisdom and folly as opposing paths or ways of life that initially look similar. So it is natural for the Son to ask his Father to help him further distinguish the 2 houses and paths so that he may see more clearly right and wrong, wisdom and folly, righteousness and wickedness. Introducing these 2 houses thus sets up and explains the structure for chapters 10 to 31. The large collection of Proverbs that follow now become individual guideposts to help the Son differentiate between the wise and foolish, industrious and sluggard, honorable and shameful, security and ruinous paths of life. Nor is it surprising to find the very first proverb in chapter 10, verse 1 to be, "A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son grief to his mother." The call of wisdom, the Father's encouragement to seek wisdom and avoid folly, and the remarkable similarities between the 2 houses is still true today. Every one of us must sit as a son at the Father's feet and listen to His encouragement to value, seek, and obtain wisdom. We also must learn to differentiate between the 2 houses. Can we? Are we always successful? Do we know which house we are currently sitting in and which woman we have chosen to eat with? How can we know for sure? Today, representatives of both wisdom and folly put forth experts in the highest places in the city to give us advice about all areas of our life. They prepare their arguments, and on the surface, both sound convincing. Their messages appeal to facts, opinion polls, charts, sympathy, and news. Their purpose is to call you into their house, to their side of the argument. But can you always tell which one is speaking? Let me list a few of the conversations going on between the representatives of the houses of wisdom and folly. What is the correct attitude towards sexual orientations? What is the right definition of marriage? Is sex between two consenting adults all right? Should prostitution be considered wrong since it's legal in some countries? Is abortion simply a surgical procedure guided by the woman's choice, or is it killing an unborn human? Is it a fetus or a baby? And when does a fetus become a human being? Are all religions equal? Is capital punishment inhumane? And if so, how does that affect abortions? Should pornography be acceptable? Is it all right to go into debt with credit cards? Should gambling be legal? Should we be concerned about dressing modestly? Should we be offended by cursing or crude jokes? Does it matter what movies we watch or songs we listen to? There are many competing invitations that are calling out to you. Which house do you sit in? Until next time.